Part 1. The day they were sold. The auction block in Red Hollow was nothing more than a flatbed wagon parked outside Harlan's feed store, but by 9 in the morning it had drawn half the town. People came the way they always came to bad things. Quietly at first, then in clusters, until there was a proper crowd and no one had to admit they'd come on purpose. Men leaned against porch rails with their arms crossed. Women stood a little further back, not wanting to be seen looking, but looking all the same. A few boys had climbed up onto the water trough for a better view, and nobody told them to get down. Delilah Whitaker stood at the edge of the wagon bed and kept her eyes on the horizon. She had decided, sometime in the last hour, that she would not look at the crowd. She would not give them that. She fixed her gaze on the blue line of mountains far to the west, the jagged, snow-dusted peaks that sat beyond everything this town had ever built, and she held on to that view the way a person holds on to something when everything else is being taken. Behind her, her three sisters waited. Maeve was 24, 2 years younger than Delilah, and she was the one who'd been crying. She'd stopped now. Her face had gone flat and careful, the way it always did when she was frightened past a certain point. She stood with her shoulders pulled in, making herself smaller, which was hard for a woman her size, and she knew it, and still she tried. Clara was 19 and had not said a word in 2 hours. She held Ivy's hand. Ivy was 16 and should not have been here at all. Should have been home, should have been somewhere with a roof over her head and food in front of her, should have been given the ordinary mercy of being a child for a little while longer. But their uncle had decided otherwise, and what Harlan Whitaker decided happened. He was standing below the wagon now, talking to the man from the land office. Short, thick through the middle, with a face that had gone soft and red in the years since he'd come into guardianship of the four of them. He wore his good coat. He'd combed his hair. He had the look of a man conducting legitimate business, and that, Delilah thought, was the most nauseating thing about him. "Fine morning for it," she heard him say. The land office man made a non-committal sound and wrote something in his ledger. 3 weeks ago, Harlan had presented papers Delilah had never seen before, papers signed by a judge in a county she'd never visited, claiming that the estate their father had left was worthless, that the debts against it exceeded its value, and that as the legal guardian of 4 unmarried women, he was entitled to recover those debts through whatever lawful means were available. The lawyer who'd read the papers to them had not met Delilah's eyes while he explained what that meant. It meant this: a wagon, a crowd, the open sky above Red Hollow going flat and white as the sun climbed. "We should have run," Maeve said quietly from behind her. "Run where?" Clara answered. Neither of them said anything after that. The auctioneer, a man named Dodd, who also sold horses and did not seem to notice the difference, climbed up onto the wagon and called for quiet. He had a carrying voice, the kind that filled a space without effort, and the crowd settled into itself and went still the way crowds do when something is about to start. 4 women, Dodd announced as if reading from a list, of working age and good health, available for contract labor, domestic service, or... He paused, and someone in the crowd laughed. "Any other lawful arrangement. Bidding starts at $20 for the lot." Delilah's hands curled at her sides. $20 for the lot. She thought about the horses her father used to sell. He'd gotten $45 for a 3-year-old mare with good bloodlines and a sound temperament. $45. And he'd said afterward that he'd underpriced her. $20 for 4 human beings, and Dodd said it like it was a reasonable place to start. The crowd stirred. A man in the front called out 25, and Delilah recognized him. He ran the laundry operation on the south end of town and had a reputation for working people until they dropped and then replacing them without ceremony. Another voice came from somewhere on the left, offering 30, and then someone else raised it to 35, and there was a ripple of laughter because the bidding was apparently entertainment. "Too much woman for any sensible man," someone called out, and there was more laughter, louder this time. Delilah closed her eyes for a moment. She was not ashamed of her body. She had decided that a long time ago, in a small, quiet act of stubbornness that had cost her nothing and saved her more than she could measure. She knew what she looked like. She knew what people said. She had learned to carry herself in a way that absorbed those facts without letting them in too deep, the way thick bark grows around an old wound in a tree. But standing on this wagon, in front of these people, with the sun on her face and no place to go, the bark wasn't quite enough today. Ivy made a small sound behind her, something that wasn't quite a word. "Don't," Delilah said, low and even. Stand up straight, all of you. Don't give them anything. She felt Maeve shift, heard Clara murmur something to Ivy, and then she felt, rather than heard, her three sisters straighten, spine by spine, one after another, and she held on to that. She held on to it hard. The bidding had climbed to 55. The laundryman seemed determined. The other voices had mostly dropped away, which meant the entertainment was fading and the transaction was becoming real, and the crowd was settling into the familiar, slightly uncomfortable silence of watching something happen that nobody wanted to stop. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice said, 200. Everything stopped. Not just the bidding. Everything. The shuffling and the murmuring and the small restless movements of people who'd been standing in the sun. All of it went quiet so fast it was almost physical, like a hand pressed over a sound. Delilah turned. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was not a man she knew, but she recognized the type of space he occupied. He was very tall, not just tall the way men describe themselves, but genuinely large in a way that reorganized the geometry of wherever he stood. The people nearest to him had taken a half step back without seeming to notice they'd done it. He wore a long dark coat, trail-worn and not recently cleaned, and a hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his eyes from where she stood. He hadn't raised his hand. He hadn't moved at all. He had simply spoken, and the number he'd said had fallen into the auction like a stone into still water. Dodd recovered first. $200 from, he squinted, from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 210? Silence. Harlan Whitaker turned toward the voice with an expression Delilah couldn't entirely read. Something between surprise and calculation, the look of a man trying to decide whether an unexpected development was a threat or an opportunity. 250, said a different voice. The laundryman, stung into competing again. 300, said the man in the back. Without hesitation, without any change in posture or tone. The laundryman opened his mouth, closed it. Do I hear 310? Dodd called, and he was already looking at the laundryman with an expression of professional hope that was clearly doomed. Nothing. $300 once, Dodd said. $300 twice. Wait. Harlan stepped forward. He was smiling now, the smile he wore when he thought he was managing a situation. I'd like to know the buyer's intentions. These are my nieces, and I have a— You've been paid, the tall man said. Still from the back, still without moving. Your intentions were settled when you put them on the wagon. Harlan's smile went slightly fixed. $300 sold, Dodd said, quickly, like a man closing a door before a storm got in. The crowd parted. He walked through it the way water finds a channel. Not aggressively, not with any theater, just with the particular certainty of someone who has never had to ask for space because space has always been given. He stopped at the base of the wagon and looked up at the four of them, and for the first time Delilah could see his face clearly. He was not a young man, somewhere in his late 30s perhaps, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something hard and left to weather. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, old and pale, and his eyes were a color Delilah couldn't immediately name. Not quite gray, not quite green, something in between that caught the light strangely. He looked at each of them in turn. Not the way the crowd had been looking at them, not with that particular mixture of assessment and mockery. He looked at them the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. His gaze settled on Delilah last. I'm Gideon Cross, he said. I own the Cross Ranch, about 40 miles north. I'm not going to separate you. Delilah studied him. Why not? She said. He seemed to consider this as a fair question. Because they're not selling one of you. They're selling all four, and I don't do things halfway. What do you want from us? Maeve asked, from behind her, and her voice was steadier than Delilah expected. Workers, Gideon said. Honest ones. He looked at Maeve when he said it, directly, without the usual downward flicker that people gave when they were trying not to notice the size of the person they were speaking to. I've got a ranch that's grown past what I can manage alone. I need people who know how to work. Whether you know how to work is something I don't know yet, but you'll have the chance to prove it if you want it. And if we don't want it, Delilah asked, then I'll drive you somewhere you'd rather be. He said it simply, with no edge on it. You're not property. The money I paid was to get you off that wagon. What you do after is your own business. Behind Delilah, Ivy made that small sound again. but different this time. Less like fear. Harlan pushed through the last of the crowd with his face going red and his good coat flapping. Now just a moment, he said. These women are my family, and I have a responsibility. You sold them, Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. For $300, which is in that man's ledger with your signature on it, you don't have a responsibility anymore. You have a receipt. The crowd was very quiet. Harlan looked around at it, as if hoping to find allies, and found only people looking away. This isn't finished, he said. For today it is, Gideon replied. He looked back up at the wagon. You want to come down? Delilah looked at her sisters. Maeve gave her a small nod, barely visible, but there. Clara had her arm around Ivy's shoulders. Ivy was staring at Gideon Cross with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Not trust, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, the cautious, watchful interest of a person who has been disappointed enough times to not lead with hope, but can't quite kill it either. Delilah stepped off the wagon. The ride north took the better part of 2 days, with one night spent camped beside a creek where the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first pale green. Gideon drove the wagon and said very little. The sisters talked among themselves, sometimes in low voices, sometimes not at all, adjusting to the strange new weight of what had happened. On the first evening, while Gideon was tending the horses, Maeve sat down beside Delilah at the fire and said, "What do you think he actually wants?" "Don't know yet," Delilah said. "Men don't spend $300 out of charity." "No, they don't." Delilah poked at the fire. "But he could have gotten charity cheaper. He could have spent $50 and separated us, and we wouldn't have had any say about it." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "He's got something in mind." "Everybody's got something in mind," Delilah said. "The question is whether what he's got in mind is something we can live with." Clara had fallen asleep with Ivy's head on her shoulder, both of them wrapped in the same blanket, and in the firelight they looked for a moment like the younger versions of themselves that Delilah could still remember. Before their parents died. Before Harlan. Before the slow, grinding years of hunger and dismissal, and being told, in ways large and small, that they were too much and not enough simultaneously. She watched them sleep for a while. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "at least we're all in the same place to deal with it." The Cross Ranch announced itself from a distance. Delilah saw it first, a break in the tree line, and then a cluster of buildings that were bigger than she'd expected, more solid, built to last rather than to impress. The main house was 2 stories, log and stone, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. There were several outbuildings, a large barn, and a corral that held, even at this distance, what looked like a substantial number of horses. "How many people work here?" she asked. 6, Gideon said. "Used to be more. Some left for the mining camps. A couple of the older hands retired. I haven't been able to replace them fast enough." "What do you run?" "Cattle, mainly. Some horses. There's good money in horses if you know what you're doing, which I only partly do." He glanced at her sideways. "You know horses?" "My father did," she said. "I grew up with them." He didn't say anything to that, but she noticed he filed it away somewhere. The ranch hands who came out to meet them were cautious in the way of people who'd had surprises go badly before. There were 2 men about Gideon's age, a younger man who couldn't have been more than 20, and an older woman, Nettie, who turned out to run the house, who looked at the 4 sisters with an expression of pure, undisguised relief. "About time," Nettie said to Gideon, which was not what any of them expected her to say. "This is Nettie Holt," Gideon said. "She's been trying to manage this entire operation by herself for the past 8 months, and she's stopped being polite about it." "I stopped being polite about it in month 2, Nettie said. She was perhaps 60, with white hair pinned up without much care and hands that showed decades of actual work. She looked at each of the sisters in turn with the direct, appraising look of a person who has no time to waste on impressions. "You'll want a bath and a meal. Come on." She turned and walked back toward the house, and after a moment's hesitation, Claire and Ivy followed her, because Nettie was the kind of person it didn't occur to you not to follow. Delilah stayed where she was. "You said workers," she said to Gideon. "I did." "What does that actually mean? What are the terms? What do we get paid? What are the hours? What are our quarters?" He looked at her with that same assessing expression she'd seen on the wagon. Not unfriendly, not condescending, just careful, The way a person is careful when they're trying to be accurate. $40 a month each for now. That'll go up if you're good. Quarters in the east wing of the house. Separate rooms. Nettie already has them set up. Work starts at first light and ends when the work is done, which is how it works for everyone here, including me. He paused. Any questions? What are we allowed to say no to? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but something in that direction. Anything you want to say no to, he said. You're not property. I said that. People say a lot of things, Delilah said. Yes, he said. They do. He held her gaze. So do I. I'll leave it to you to figure out the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and walked toward the house. The first week was the hardest, because the first week was about learning. Delilah learned the horses. There were 17 of them in the main corral, and within 2 days she had their names, their temperaments, their particular fears and habits, the small negotiations each of them required. The ranch hands, Jake and Tom and the young one, whose name was Percy, watched her work and did not offer advice, which was the appropriate response to someone who clearly did not need it. On the third morning, she was in the corral with a bay gelding who had been throwing riders, running him through a series of patient circles, when she heard Gideon's voice from the fence. Where'd you learn that? My father, she said, not looking up. He said most horses that throw people are horses that were never properly introduced to what they were being asked to do. They're not mean, they're surprised. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he knew what he was doing. He did, Delilah said. She kept her attention on the gelding. He was a good man. It was a pity about the inheritance. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she could stop it, dry and flat, with a bitterness she'd thought she had under better control. Gideon didn't respond immediately. When he did speak, he said, Do you want to tell me about the inheritance or not? Not today, she said. All right. He stayed at the fence for another few minutes, watching her work, and then he left, and she let herself feel, briefly, the strange discomfort of being around a man who asked questions and then stopped asking when you said you didn't want to answer. She wasn't used to that. Maeve found the account books on the fourth day. She found them in the office off the main room. 3 years of ledgers written in Gideon's hand, clear enough to read but chaotic in organization. The record of a man who understood his operation from the inside but had never been taught to see it from the outside. There were patterns she spotted in 20 minutes that she suspected he hadn't seen in 3 years. She sat at the desk for most of the afternoon, and then she went looking for him. He was in the barn. You've been undercharging for the horses, she said without preamble. The ones you've been selling to the cavalry contracts. You're charging the same rate you were 2 years ago, and the market's moved. You've left probably $400 on the table in the last 18 months alone. He put down the harness he was working on and looked at her. You get all that from one afternoon with the books? I could get more if you gave me a week. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Get more. She was back at the desk before dark. Checked. Claire set up her workroom in the corner of the barn where the light was good, and within a week she had reorganized the medical supplies Gideon kept, badly organized, she said, in the flat way she said most things, and had written out a clear system for the ranch hands to use. The young hand, Percy, had a badly healed break in his right hand that had been causing him pain for months, and Clara looked at it for a long time and then told him, with characteristic directness, what could be done to help it. You're a doctor? He asked. No, she said, but I've had to be useful, so I paid attention to things. Percy's hand was better within 3 weeks, and after that he followed Clara around with the devotion of a large, good-natured dog, which she found both endearing and mildly inconvenient. Oh, Ivy painted. She painted on whatever she could find, the backs of old ledger pages, pieces of wood, one memorable occasion on a length of canvas that Nettie had been intending for a different purpose and did not say much about afterward because the result was beautiful. She painted the mountains, the horses, the way the light came across the valley in the late afternoon, Percy's face when he didn't know she was looking, the old cottonwood at the south end of the pasture, Delilah's hands. She had not painted in 2 years. Harlan had considered it a waste of material. Gideon came to look one morning and stood in front of the canvas that showed the valley from the high ridge to the east. The way the land spread itself out below, the small, dark shape of the ranch buildings in the middle distance, the mountains beyond. He looked at it for a long time. "That's mine," he said. "I know," Ivy said cautiously. "It's mine and I've never seen it like that." He paused. "May I keep it?" She blinked at him. "You want to buy it?" "If you'll let me." Yes," she said. And then, because she was 16 and some things still surprised her, "Nobody's ever asked to buy one of my paintings before." "Then they weren't paying attention," Gideon said, and went back to work. 3 weeks in, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no moment you could point to and say, "Here, this is where it changed." It was more like the way weather changes, gradually, then all at once. The ranch hands stopped being careful around the sisters and started being simply around them, the way you are around people you've accepted as part of the machinery of your daily life. Nettie began including all 4 of them in the planning of things, not because she'd been told to, but because it was efficient and she was a practical woman. Percy started bringing Ivy better canvas from the supply store in town, without being asked. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the light was going, sometimes all of them, the sisters, the hands, Nettie, and Gideon, ended up on the porch or around the kitchen table, and there was conversation that was not about work, and laughter that was not careful, and for moments that Delilah found herself counting and hoarding like coins. It felt like something she had not felt in a very long time. It felt like a house that was becoming a home. She did not trust it. Not fully. She was not built for full trust, not yet, not after the years she'd had. But she noted it. She allowed it to exist. She let herself, on certain evenings, sitting on the porch steps with the mountains going dark in the distance and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen, feel something cautious and fragile and stubborn that might, with enough time and enough evidence, turn itself into peace. And then, on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after they'd arrived, one of the hands came back from the supply run into town with a face that said he'd heard something he didn't want to repeat. He told Gideon first. Gideon found Delilah in the corral. "There's a story going around," he said without greeting. "Your uncle is telling people I kidnapped you, all 4 of you. He's saying you were taken against your will, and he's seeking legal remedy." Delilah stood very still. The bay gelding moved alongside her, sensing the change in her posture, and she put a hand on his neck without thinking about it. "How far has it spread?" she asked. "Far enough that the sheriff in Caldwell has heard it." He paused. "And there are men asking questions about the ranch, asking about whether 4 women are being held here." She looked at the mountains. She should have known. She should have known it wouldn't hold. Things did not simply change because you moved 40 miles north and found someone who treated you decently. Harlan had not lost $300 and 4 workers without deciding to do something about it. And a man like Harlan, small and mean and determined, with enough money to cause trouble, could do quite a lot. "What do we do?" she said. Gideon looked at her levelly. "That depends on what you want to do." "I want to fight," Delilah said. She said it before she'd finished thinking it, and once it was said, she found she meant it completely. "He doesn't get to take this. He doesn't get to reach 40 miles north and take this too." Gideon held her gaze. Something in his face settled. "All right," he said. "Then we fight." The word fight sat in Delilah's chest for the rest of that day, heavy and necessary, like a stone she'd picked up and decided to carry. She didn't tell her sisters right away. She needed a few hours first, needed to let the information settle, needed to understand the shape of what they were dealing with before she tried to explain it to 3 other people who had their own particular ways of falling apart and pulling themselves back together. Maeve would go cold and analytical, which was useful, but sometimes ran ahead of the facts. Clara would want to act immediately, and her idea of action tended toward the direct and occasionally the unwise. Ivy would go quiet in a way that was harder to watch than crying. So Delilah worked through the afternoon. She finished with the bay gelding, moved on to a young mare who'd been favoring her left front leg, and spent an hour with her hands and her attention and the particular silent negotiation that horses required. And when the light started going, she finally put the tools away and went to find her sisters. She found all 3 of them already in the kitchen with Nettie. which meant Nettie had heard and told them before Delilah had the chance. That was the thing about ranch life, says. Information moved through it the way water moved through soil, not all at once, but steadily, and by the time you thought you were the one bringing news, everyone already had it. Maeve looked up when Delilah came through the door. "We know," she said. "I figured." Clara was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug, and her face had the particular flatness it got when she was angrier than she knew what to do with. Ivy sat beside her, not quite touching her, close enough that their shoulders were almost in contact. "He's going to keep doing this," Clara said. "Whatever we do, wherever we go, he's going to keep reaching." "Maybe," Delilah said. She pulled out a chair and sat. "Or maybe we stop letting him reach." "How?" Maeve asked. "He's got money. He's got connections in town. He knows the sheriff in Caldwell personally. You know that, right? They go back years. If this gets to a legal proceeding, we're starting behind." "I know," Delilah said. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we don't run. We've been running for 6 years. We ran from the farm when he took it. We ran from the house in Millhaven when he sold the furniture out from under us. We ended up on that wagon because we had nowhere left to run to." She looked around the table. "I'm done running." Nobody said anything for a moment. Nettie, at the stove, made a sound that was not quite words but was clearly agreement. "He's calling it kidnapping," Maeve said finally. "That's a serious thing to have on record, even if it's a lie." "Then we need our own record," Delilah said. "We need something in writing that says what he did, what he took, what those years were actually like. We need to put it in front of someone who isn't in his pocket." "A lawyer," Maeve said. "A lawyer, and not one from Caldwell." Gideon left for Harwick 2 days later. Harwick was the county seat, 30 miles east, far enough from Caldwell that its legal machinery operated independently. Different courthouse, different sheriff, different web of who owed what to whom. He took Jake with him because Jake had been born in Harwick and still had people there, which was worth something when you were trying to find a lawyer who would take a case against a man with money and connections. He was gone 4 days. The sisters worked. They worked the way they'd all been working since the first week. Hard and without complaint, and with a seriousness that the ranch hands had long since stopped being surprised by. But there was an edge underneath it now, something that hummed below the surface of the days like a wire pulled too tight. On the second evening, Maeve came to Delilah's room and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "What if the lawyer won't take it?" "Then we find another one." "And if nobody will take it? If Harlan's already gotten to everyone in range?" Delilah was quiet for a moment. She was mending a piece of tack by lamplight, her hands moving slowly through the familiar work, and she didn't look up. "Then we deal with that when it happens. I'm not going to start losing a fight that hasn't happened yet." "You're better at that than I am," Maeve said. She said it without envy, just as a fact. "You're better at other things." Delilah finally looked up. "Maeve, you found $400 in those ledgers in one afternoon. You've reorganized the accounts so well that Gideon's already talking about going after contracts he turned down last year because the numbers didn't make sense to him. You can see the shape of things. That's what we're going to need." Maeve looked at her hands. "I keep thinking about how we ended up on that wagon," she said. "I keep going back over it, trying to find the point where I should have done something different, where I should have been smarter or faster or—" "Stop," Delilah said, not unkindly but firmly. "You were 24 years old with no money and no legal standing, and he had papers from a judge. There was nothing to be smarter about." "I know," Maeve said. "I know that. I just—" She stopped, started again. "I don't want to feel that helpless again. I don't want to be in a situation where the only thing that saves us is someone else deciding to do the right thing." "Neither do I," Delilah said. "So let's build something that doesn't depend on that." It wasn't a comforting answer exactly. It wasn't meant to be. But Maeve stayed for another hour, and by the time she left she had a clearer head, which was sometimes the best you could do. Gideon came back with a lawyer named Amos Farrell. Farrell was not an impressive-looking man. He was small and thin, somewhere past 50, with a suit that had been good once and a briefcase that had been through considerable history. He had a precise way of speaking, not elegant, just exact, the way a carpenter is exact. And he listened to what the sisters told him the way a doctor listens, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, storing everything in some internal place where it would be sorted and used. They sat around the kitchen table for most of an evening. Nettie kept coffee coming. Gideon sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, because he had the sense to know this was not his story to tell. Delilah talked first because she had always been the one to go first. She laid it out plainly. The deaths of their parents, the years under Harlan's guardianship, the systematic emptying of the estate through expenses that were never explained and sales that were never discussed, the hunger and the bad winters, the way Harlan had gradually reduced their circumstances until there was nowhere to go and then made a profit on the fact that there was nowhere to go. Maeve had brought the papers she'd managed to keep, copies of the estate documents she'd made years ago, before Harlan realized she was making copies, folded and hidden and carried with her from place to place until she'd finally been able to put them somewhere safe. She spread them on the table and walked Farrell through them, and as she talked, Delilah watched something shift behind the lawyer's careful eyes. "These transfers," he said, indicating a column of numbers. "These were made without the knowledge of the estate's beneficiaries." "Without our knowledge, yes," Maeve said. "We were never shown the books. I found these documents in his desk while he was in town one afternoon. I copied them because I thought they looked wrong, and I didn't know what else to do with that feeling." Farrell looked at the papers for a long moment. "Your feeling was correct," he said. Clara spoke next, about the physical conditions. The winter when the firewood ran out and Harlan had said there was no money for more, and they had burned furniture to stay warm, while 3 months later he'd bought himself a new horse. Ivy, who had been quiet through most of it, spoke last, and she spoke about small things. The art supplies that had been sold without asking her, the way Harlan had told her when she was 13 that her paintings were worthless and painting was vanity, and how she had believed him for years because he was the adult in the room and adults were supposed to know things. When she stopped talking, the kitchen was very quiet. "The kidnapping claim," Farrell said. "I've seen the language he's using. It's poorly constructed, legally speaking, because he clearly wrote it or had it written before he thought through the implications." He set down his coffee cup. "A man who willingly accepts $300 for the labor contracts of his wards, signed and witnessed, cannot subsequently claim those same wards were taken against their will. The transaction contradicts the allegation." "He's counting on the fact that nobody will look too closely," Maeve said. "Some people won't," Farrell agreed. "But in a courthouse, the documents speak. And these documents," he gestured at the papers spread across the table, "tell a story that Mr. Whitaker is going to have difficulty countering." "Can you help us?" Delilah asked. Farrell looked at her steadily. "I can. I should tell you it won't be quick and it won't be without cost, and there will likely be moments where it becomes unpleasant." He paused. "But the legal basis is solid, particularly with regard to the estate mismanagement. If I'm reading these correctly, there are grounds for a civil claim that would far exceed any amount your uncle could recover through his kidnapping fiction." Gideon spoke for the first time in 2 hours. "My operation will cover the legal costs," he said. All 4 sisters looked at him. "You don't have to do that," Delilah said. "I know I don't have to," he said. He said it the same way he said most things, without performance, without waiting for a response, as if the statement was simply a fact being introduced into the room. Delilah looked at him for a moment. She wanted to argue, and she couldn't find the ground to argue from, which was a feeling she was not entirely comfortable with. "We'll pay you back," she said. "If you want," he said. "It's not a condition." Farrell left the next morning with enough paper to build a case and a list of witnesses, mostly former hands who'd worked the Whitaker estate in the early years, people who'd seen enough to be useful if they could be found. The ranch settled back into its work, but the writers started the following week. The first one came on a Thursday. A man Delilah didn't recognize, riding a good horse and asking the ranch hand he met at the gate whether there were women living on the property. Percy, who had no gift for deception but a strong instinct for when someone was looking for trouble, told him there were women employed on the property, yes, and asked what his business was. The man said he was passing through and rode away. The second one came 3 days later, and this one she did recognize. He was a man named Cutter, who did irregular work around Caldwell, the kind of work that required not asking questions, and the fact that he'd ridden 40 miles to ask about women at a private ranch was not, she thought, coincidence. She was the one who went out to meet him that time. "Delilah Whitaker," he said, looking her over with the flat assessment of a man who has been told to identify a specific object. "That's me," she said. "What do you want?" "Your uncle sends his regards. He's concerned about your welfare." "Is he?" He's saying you're being held here under— I know what he's saying, Delilah said. I'm standing in the yard of a ranch where I work, talking to you of my own free will, with no one telling me what to say. Does that look like being held? Cutter looked past her toward the house, which was where Gideon was currently standing on the porch, with his arms at his sides, and an expression that communicated, without any particular drama, that the conversation in the yard had his complete attention. Your uncle's going to the sheriff, Cutter said. He can go to whoever he likes, Delilah said. I'm not going anywhere. She held his gaze until he looked away first, and then she turned her back on him and walked back to the house. On the porch, she stopped beside Gideon. That's the second one, she said. I know. He's escalating. She watched Cutter ride away down the track, raising dust in the dry afternoon air. He's not going to stop with messengers. No, Gideon agreed. He's not. She'd known that. She had known it since the moment Gideon told her about the rumors. But knowing it and standing in the yard watching it arrive were two different things, and she stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, letting it become real. When did you last write to Farrell? She asked. Yesterday. He wrote back this morning. Gideon reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded letter. He's found two of the former hands, both willing to testify. He's also found something in the original estate documents that he thinks constitutes fraud, not civil, criminal. Delilah unfolded the letter. Read it again. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? She asked. You were working, he said. It was a simple answer, and it was also, she realized, a respectful one. He hadn't assumed she'd want to be interrupted. He'd waited until the workday was done. She folded the letter and held on to it. Criminal fraud, she said. If Farrell's right, Harlan isn't just looking at losing the civil case. He's looking at being prosecuted. Yes. Which means he knows he needs to move fast, before Farrell has everything in order. She looked out at the empty track where Cutter had disappeared. That's why the riders. Gideon nodded. Delilah felt the fear and the anger and the old exhaustion all moving through her at once, the familiar weight of it, and underneath all of that something newer and harder that she was still learning to name. Not hope exactly, closer to resolve, the specific feeling of a person who has decided to stop waiting to see what happens next. Then we need to move faster than he does, she said. She wrote to Farrell herself that night, by lamplight, at the desk in the office, with Maeve's reorganized ledgers stacked neatly on the shelf behind her. She was not a trained writer. She had never been taught to construct a legal document or compose formal correspondence, and she knew it showed in the letter. But she wrote down what she knew and what she'd seen and what she could prove in clear, plain sentences without decoration, and when she was finished, she sat back and read it through and decided it was honest, which was the best she could do. Maeve came in while she was folding it. Can I add something? Maeve asked. Delilah slid the paper across the desk. Maeve sat down, read what Delilah had written, and then picked up the pen and added 2 paragraphs at the bottom. Specific, precise, citing document references and dates, the kind of detail that Delilah had known were needed and hadn't known how to articulate. When she handed the letter back, it was better. We make a decent team, Delilah said. We always did, Maeve said. We just didn't have anywhere to use it. Clara appeared in the doorway. Ivy's asleep, she said. I gave her something for the headache. She's been tense all week. I know, Delilah said. She's scared, Clara said. She won't say it because she doesn't want to make things worse, but she's scared. So am I, Delilah said. She said it plainly because there was no point in pretending otherwise with these 2 women who had shared every bad year with her. Being scared's not the problem. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to be. The problem is letting it make decisions for you. Clara leaned against the doorframe. She was quiet for a moment. Not the frightened quiet she sometimes had, but the thoughtful kind. You know what I keep thinking about? She said. That first morning here, when I found the supply room, it was a disaster. Completely disorganized. Things expired, things missing. I spent all day reorganizing it, and no one asked me to. I just did it because it needed doing. She paused. It was the first time in years I'd done something because I decided it needed doing, not because someone told me to. Nobody spoke for a moment. He took that from us, Maeve said quietly. That's the thing he actually took.
Not the money, not the estate. The ability to do things because we decided to. Delilah sealed the letter. Then that's what we're taking back, she said.
3 weeks later, Gideon's contact in Harwick sent word that a warrant had been issued for Harlan Whitaker's financial records. The following morning, 2 riders came to the ranch who were not Cutter and were not asking questions. These men had the look of men who'd been sent to do something rather than find something out. They stopped at the gate and looked at the property with the measuring eyes of men who were counting exits and distances. Percy came to find Gideon. Gideon went to find Delilah. She was in the north pasture with the horses, and when she saw his face, she didn't ask what had happened. She just fell into step beside him, and they walked back toward the house together, and the 2 men at the gate watched them come. "I know those men," Jake said from the barn door. His voice was flat and careful. "The one on the gray works for the Caldwell sheriff as a deputy. The other one I don't know." "A deputy," Delilah said. "Or someone who used to be one," Jake said, which was a distinction that carried its own particular weight in the kind of territory where the line between official authority and personal violence was not always clearly marked. She looked at the gate. The 2 men hadn't come through it. They were waiting. "This is how it starts," she said, and she meant it not as a complaint but as a fact. The way you'd say this is where the trail forks, noting the reality of a thing so you could navigate it clearly. "Yes," Gideon said. "Then let's go see what they want." She walked toward the gate, and he walked beside her, and behind them she could hear, without looking, the sound of the ranch house door opening and closing, and footsteps on the porch. And she knew without looking that her sisters had come out to watch. She knew because they always did. Because the 4 of them had never been able to stay inside when the other was walking toward something hard, not in 6 years of hard things, not once. Whatever was coming, they were going to face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together. The deputy's name was Aldous Vane, and he had the face of a man who had been told he was important often enough that he'd stopped questioning it. He sat his horse at the gate with the particular posture of someone who expected people to come to him, and when Delilah and Gideon walked up and stopped on their side of the fence without opening it, something flickered across his expression. Not quite annoyance, but the beginning of it. "Gideon Cross," he said. "That's right," Gideon said. "I've got questions about some women reported to be on this property." Vane's eyes moved to Delilah, then back to Gideon, the way some men did, addressing the man as if the woman present was furniture that had yet to be identified. "Women whose guardian has filed a complaint with the sheriff's office in Caldwell." "I'm one of those women," Delilah said. Vane looked at her again. This time he stayed looking. "You're Delilah Whitaker?" "I am." "Your uncle says you are being held here against your will." "My uncle says a lot of things," Delilah said. "I'm standing at my own gate, talking to you without anyone's hand on my arm, and I've got 3 sisters inside that house who will tell you the same thing. Does that look like being held against my will?" Vane shifted in the saddle. "I need to speak to all 4 of you." "Then come inside," Gideon said. He finally opened the gate. "I've got nothing to hide, and neither do they. But you come in as a guest, not as a man executing a seizure, because you don't have papers for a seizure, and we both know it." That landed. Vane looked at him for a moment, doing the calculation, whether to push, whether the ground was solid enough to push on, and apparently decided it wasn't, because he dismounted and handed his reins to the second man, who stayed outside. Takastigi. They sat in the main room, which was where Gideon received visitors, and which had enough space that nobody had to feel cornered. Nettie brought coffee without being asked, and then positioned herself in the kitchen doorway in the way she did when she wanted to be present without being officially present, which Delilah had come to recognize as one of Nettie's more useful habits. All 4 sisters were there. Maeve had her account books with her, which Delilah recognized as a deliberate choice. The book said, "I have nothing to hide, and also I was in the middle of work when you arrived." Clara sat straight-backed with her hands in her lap. Ivy was beside Clara, and she was not quite as still as she was trying to appear, but she held it together, and Delilah was proud of her without having the moment to say so. Vane went through his questions methodically. He had a notebook, and he wrote things down in it, and he asked each of them in turn whether they were present at the ranch of their own free will. Each of them said yes. He asked whether anyone had forced or coerced them to come to the property. Each of them said no. He asked about the circumstances of the auction in Red Hollow, and Delilah answered that one, plainly, including the part where their uncle had signed a legal document accepting payment. Do you have that document? Vane asked. Our lawyer does, Gideon said. Amos Farrell, out of Harwick. He also has the original estate documents, copies of which were obtained by Maeve Whitaker several years ago, which show a pattern of financial mismanagement that is currently under review by the Harwick courthouse. Vane's pen stopped moving. Under review, he repeated. Criminal review, Gideon said, and said it the way you'd say it might rain tomorrow, calmly, without satisfaction, just as information. Vane looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the sisters, one by one. He was doing a different kind of calculation now. Delilah could see it. The kind where a man realizes he may have ridden 40 miles to hand himself a problem instead of solve one. I'll need to verify this with the Harwick courthouse, he said. Of course, Gideon said. Farrell's expecting contact. Here's his address. He handed over a card he'd had ready. Had it ready, Delilah noticed, which meant he'd anticipated exactly this conversation, which meant he'd been thinking about it before she had, which was something she filed away without comment. Vane closed his notebook. He stood, replaced his hat, and looked at Delilah one more time. If you have any concerns about your situation here, he said, in the careful tone of a man covering himself, you're welcome to come to the sheriff's office in Caldwell. Thank you, Delilah said. But I'm exactly where I want to be. He left. The room held its breath until the sound of hooves faded down the track. Then Clara let out a long exhale that sounded like it had been compressed for the past hour, and Nettie came out of the kitchen with the coffee and said, Well, he won't be back in a hurry. He'll be back, Gideon said, but next time he'll have done his homework, and by then Farrell will have done his. The waiting was the worst part. Delilah had never been good at it. She could work through fear, had proven that repeatedly. But waiting was different because waiting had no task inside it, no way to direct the energy of it. She managed by staying in motion, which was how she'd always managed, filling the days with the horses and the corral and the long conversations with Jake and Tom about bloodlines and breeding stock. And if the others noticed that she was working slightly longer hours than strictly necessary, they were tactful enough not to say so. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything for the first week. On the 8th day, he came out to the corral in the late afternoon while she was working a young horse through groundwork, and he leaned on the fence in the way he did when he intended to stay, and she worked the horse for another 20 minutes before she brought him in and came to stand at the fence herself. You don't have to watch, she said. I know. Then why do you? He looked at her with that even, unhurried look of his. Because you're good at it, he said. And there aren't that many things in this world that are worth watching when they're done well. Delilah looked back at the horse. It was a simple enough thing to say, and he'd said it without any freight on it, the way he said most things. Not as a compliment designed to produce a reaction, just as the truth as he saw it. She'd learned over the weeks that this was how he worked. He said what he thought, didn't decorate it, and didn't track whether it landed the way he'd intended. I don't know what to do with all this waiting, she admitted. No, he agreed. You could tell me it'll be over soon. I could. It might even be true. He paused. But you don't actually want me to tell you that. She almost smiled. No, she said. I don't. A beat passed. The young horse moved behind her and she could feel him at her shoulder, curious and warm. My wife used to say I was too comfortable with silence, Gideon said. Came out of nowhere, or at least it seemed to, and she turned to look at him because the word wife had not come up before in any conversation she'd heard or been part of. He was looking at the mountains, and something in his face had shifted slightly, an old thing rising and settling. She said most men use silence to avoid things. She said I used it to be present, which was different, but she wasn't always sure which one I was doing. Was she right? Delilah asked carefully. Probably both, at different times. He was quiet for a moment. She died 4 years ago. Fever in the bad winter. It was fast. He said it plainly, without the particular careful control people used when they were managing grief. He said it like someone reporting a fact about the landscape. There's a ridge to the east. There's a river that floods in spring. She died 4 years ago. After that, it was just me and the ranch, and that was fine. That was manageable. I understood the terms of it. Delilah thought about asking what had changed, and then didn't ask because she could feel the shape of the answer without needing to put it into words, and sometimes naming a thing out loud too early made it smaller than it needed to be. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "Thank you," he said, and then after a pause, "She would have liked you." She had no patience for people who apologized for taking up space. Delilah stood with that for a moment. "I should finish up," she said. "Go ahead," he said, and stayed at the fence. The letter from Farrell came on a Wednesday, and it brought good news and a warning in the same envelope. The good news was that the Harwick courthouse had confirmed the financial review. The documentation Maeve had provided, combined with testimony from one of the former estate hands, a man named Garrett, who had worked the property for 8 years before Harlan had dismissed him, established a clear pattern of deliberate misappropriation. Farrell used the word embezzlement for the first time in writing. He also used the phrase criminal indictment, which Maeve read aloud at the kitchen table, and then read aloud a second time as if she needed to hear it twice to believe it. The warning was about what came before the legal process concluded. "Whitaker is aware of the investigation," Farrell wrote. "He has resources, and he is not a man who will accept defeat quietly. In my experience, men in his position become most dangerous in the period between knowing they've lost and accepting it. I would urge you to be cautious in the weeks ahead." Delilah folded the letter. Cautious was one word for it. 1. They were cautious for 12 days, and then Harlan came himself. He came on a Saturday morning, which was calculated. Saturdays, there were usually people on the road between the ranches, and witnesses mattered when you were staging something that needed to look legitimate. He came with the Caldwell sheriff, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who had the tired, resigned look of someone doing a job he wasn't entirely convinced was right, but had agreed to do anyway. He came with 4 armed men, 2 of whom Delilah recognized from around Caldwell, and 2 she'd never seen, and he came with a paper. Jake saw them coming from the East Ridge and rode hard back to the ranch, and by the time the procession reached the gate, there were people on the porch. All 4 sisters, Gideon and the 3 hands, arranged not deliberately but simply because when something is coming at you, you stand up and face it. Harlan looked up at the porch from his horse, and his eyes went straight to the sisters the way a man's eyes go to the thing he believes he owns. "Delilah," he said. "Uncle," she said. The word tasted like something she wanted to spit out, but she said it evenly. "I'm here to bring you home. This is my home." Harlan shifted his gaze to Gideon. "You've caused me considerable trouble," he said, "and it's going to stop today." He held up the paper. "I have a writ from the Caldwell courthouse authorizing the return of my wards to my custody." There was a silence. Gideon came down off the porch, slowly, and took the paper when Harlan held it out. He read it. He read it carefully, which took longer than Harlan seemed to have patience for, because by the time Gideon looked up, Harlan had already started talking again. "The women will come with me. This is a legal matter, and I expect—" "This writ is from a county court," Gideon said. "The matter of the Whitaker estate and the welfare of these women is currently under jurisdiction of the Harwick courthouse, which supersedes this document." Harlan's face went slightly red. "That's a civil proceeding. This is a piece of paper from a court your friend the sheriff has influence over," Gideon said, and he said it without heat, laying it out as simply as you'd lay out the facts about the weather. "I'm sure Judge Alderman in Caldwell was very accommodating. He usually is with you. But accommodating and legally enforceable aren't the same thing, and the Harwick proceedings make this document unenforceable." He held it back out. "You can take it to Farrell if you want a second opinion." "Farrell," Harlan said, and the way he said it told everyone present that he already knew about Farrell, had known for some time, and did not like what he knew. He didn't take the paper back. "I don't need a lawyer to tell me my own blood belongs with me." "We don't belong with you," Maeve said from the porch. She had not spoken until now, and her voice, when it came, was very steady. "We've never belonged to you. You were our guardian, which is a different thing, and you used it badly." Harlan turned to look at her. "Maeve!" "Don't," she said. "Please don't use my name like we're having a family conversation. We're not. You sold us. You signed a document accepting money for us. And before that, you spent 6 years using what our father left us to fund your own interests while we went without things that cost nothing except your willingness to share them." She paused. You took coal money in the winter of '87 and bought yourself a horse. We burned the kitchen chairs to stay warm. I have the accounts to prove it." The porch was very quiet. Sheriff Briggs, on his horse below, had the expression of a man who had begun to suspect he was on the wrong side of something and didn't yet know how to change that without admitting it. Harlan's face had gone from red to something colder. "You've been coached," he said. "Whatever this man has told you to say—" "We were cold," Clara said. She came down the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, and her voice was flat and factual and carried better than yelling. "We were hungry. We wore the same shoes for 2 winters because you said there was no money for new ones. I patched them myself. I have the scars on my fingers from the needle because I was 14 and didn't know how to sew properly and nobody taught me." She looked at him steadily. "You know what happened? Because you were there. Don't stand in this yard and tell us we're making it up." One of the armed men shifted in his saddle, not moving toward anything, just shifting, the unconscious movement of a person whose confidence in the ground they're standing on has just developed a question. Harlan looked from Clara to Maeve to Delilah. His eyes finally went to Ivy, and Ivy was the one Delilah had been watching, because Ivy was the youngest and the one who had the most years of Harlan's particular form of small cruelty. The dismissals, the comments about her painting, the way he'd spoken to her when the others weren't in the room. Ivy was standing at the top of the porch steps. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and she was shaking slightly, the visible vibration of someone holding something in very hard, and when Harlan's eyes found her, she met them. "You told me I was worthless," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she probably wanted it to, but she didn't stop. "You said it in those exact words, when I was 13 years old. You looked at a painting I'd made of Mama's house, and you said the painting was worthless, and I was going to end up worthless just like it." She stopped and then continued. "Mr. Cross offered me $5 for a painting last month. He asked to buy it. He asked because he understood it wasn't his to take." "Yeah." Her chin came up. "You never asked for anything in your life. You just took." The silence that followed was the kind that presses on you. Briggs cleared his throat. He looked at Harlan, and he looked at the sisters, and the expression on his face had completed its journey from resigned compliance into something more uncomfortable. "Harlan," he said quietly, "these women are plainly here of their own accord." "They've been manipulated," Harlan said, but the edge had gone off his voice, the certainty leaking out of it. "By who?" Delilah said. She came down off the porch herself now, stepped down into the yard, and stood in the open space between the porch and the gate. "By a man who bought us to keep us together when the alternative was being separated and sold off for $50 to the laundryman? By a man who offered us work and pay and rooms of our own and has not once told us what we owe him for it?" She looked at Harlan directly. "You want to talk about manipulation. Let's talk about signing papers in front of a judge your friend appointed in a county we'd never visited, claiming an estate was worthless when Maeve has documents showing it wasn't." She paused. "Let's talk about that." Harlan's jaw was tight. He looked at the paper in Gideon's hand, then at Briggs, then back at the porch full of women who were not going to move, and the mountain of a man standing in the yard who had not raised his voice once and was somehow more threatening for it. He made one more attempt. It was the most honest thing he'd done all morning, which wasn't saying much. "Ivy," he said, and aimed his voice at the youngest one the way a man aims something at the softest target. "You don't have to do this. You can come home. You don't have to—" He moved. Delilah saw it before it fully developed. The knee touching the horse stepping forward, Harlan leaning down with his hand extended, reaching toward Ivy, not asking, just reaching, the same way he'd always done everything. Gideon was between them before Delilah had finished drawing breath. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He simply put himself there, all 6 feet and however many inches of him between Harlan's reaching hand and Ivy's startled step back, and he put one hand up and closed it around Harlan's wrist. Not roughly, just absolutely, the way you close a gate. "No," he said. One word, no performance, no threat attached to it. Just the word and the grip, and the fact of him standing there like something that had been there since before the ranch was built and would be there long after. Harlan's horse skittered sideways. Harlan yanked his arm back and Gideon let him because he didn't need to hold it. The point had been made. "Get off my property," Gideon said. "You haven't heard the end of—" I don't need to. He stepped back. He looked up at Briggs. Sheriff, you've seen these women. You've heard what they've said. You know the situation in Harwick. I'd appreciate it if you'd note in your records that you were here and what you observed. Briggs looked at him for a moment, a long moment, the kind where a man is deciding something about himself. Then he reached into his coat, took out his own notebook, and wrote something in it. He didn't say what. He looked at Harlan. I can't compel these women, he said quietly. Not with what's in front of me. And I'm not going to try. Harlan looked at him the way a man looks at something he thought was his that has just turned out not to be. It was a brief look, but ugly. He pulled his horse around. He looked back once at the porch, and the look he gave was the kind that was meant to be frightening, the last card of a man who has run out of other cards. It landed differently than he intended. It landed small. Then he rode. His 4 men went with him, without looking back. Briggs lingered a moment, and he looked at Delilah with the slightly defeated expression of a man who had done a thing he shouldn't have done and knew it and was not quite able to apologize for it. Farrell's a good lawyer, he said. I know, Delilah said. Briggs rode away. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Percy let out a breath from the far end of the porch that was almost a laugh. High and released, the particular sound of tension leaving a body faster than expected. And Nettie made a sound from the doorway that was entirely disapproving of the whole morning, and Clara sat down on the porch steps because her legs had apparently decided they were done standing. Ivy had her arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't shaking anymore, and that was something. Delilah looked at Gideon, who was still standing in the yard. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was watching the track where the dust from Harlan's departure was still settling. And his expression was the one she'd come to know best on him, unreadable to strangers, legible to her. He was tired, not the physical kind, but the kind that comes from holding a difficult situation with enough steadiness that everyone around you can hold theirs. And then the situation is gone and you feel it. She walked over to him. You could have hurt him, she said quietly. I know, he said. You didn't. No. He looked at her sideways. He's not worth the trouble it would have caused. And he didn't deserve the clarity of it. She thought about that. The clarity of it, she repeated. Being hit by someone because you did something worth being hit for, Gideon said. It's too clean. He doesn't get that. She looked out at the mountains. The morning had gone past them while they weren't looking, and the sun was well up now, the sky a flat, washed blue, and the land spread out below the high ridge was bright and still. He'll go back and regroup, she said. Yes. He'll try something else. He'll try, Gideon said, but he's got less ground to try it from than he did this morning. Briggs saw what he saw. He'll report it accurately because now he knows the Harwick court is involved and he doesn't want to be on the wrong side of that. He paused, and Farrell's been waiting for Harlan to do something like this. He told me 2 weeks ago that the one thing that would accelerate the Harwick proceedings was Harlan showing up somewhere and behaving the way he behaves when he thinks he's in control. Delilah turned to look at him. You were expecting this. I thought it was likely. You could have told me. He looked at her directly. Would it have helped, or would it have just given you more hours of waiting with a specific shape to what you were waiting for? She held his gaze. That's not a decision you get to make for me, she said. He took that without flinching. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. It was that simple. No defense of his reasoning, no, but I meant well. Just the acknowledgement and the apology, delivered without the elaborate performance that men usually attach to apologies when they thought they'd actually had a point. It was such a direct and uncomplicated response that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. Next time, she said, tell me. All right, he said. She turned back toward the porch, where her sisters were beginning to reassemble themselves from the morning's disruption. Maeve was already talking to Nettie in a low voice, practical, focused, because Maeve's way back from fear was always to find the thing that needed organizing. Clara was listening to something Percy was saying, and Percy was using his hands the way he did when he was trying to explain something that should have been funny and kept coming out as something else. Ivy had come down off the steps and was standing in the yard with her face turned up toward the sky, eyes closed, doing nothing except breathing. Delilah looked at them, her 3 sisters, messy and complicated and frightened and stubborn, standing in the yard of a ranch that was not the home they'd been born to, but was becoming, slowly and without ceremony, the home they were making. "Gideon," she said without turning. "Yeah." "Thank you for standing between him and Ivy." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd do it again," he said. "I know," she said. She walked up the porch steps, and the morning went on around her, large and indifferent, and full of what came next. Farrell's letter arrived 6 days after Harlan rode away from the ranch, and it was the shortest letter he had sent yet. Briggs filed his report with the Harwick court yesterday morning. The content is favorable. The indictment hearing has been moved forward. Be available the week of the 14th. Maeve read it at the kitchen table and then passed it to Delilah without comment, which was how Maeve handled news that was better than she'd allowed herself to expect. She went quiet with it, careful, the way you are careful with something fragile until you're sure it's actually solid. Delilah read it twice. "Moved forward," she said. "He said it would accelerate after Harlan showed up here," Maeve said. "He was right." "Farrell's usually right," Nettie said, from the stove, with the satisfaction of a woman who had formed an opinion of Amos Farrell in the first 10 minutes of meeting him and had been quietly gratified ever since to see that opinion confirmed. Clara came in from outside, pulled off her work gloves, and read the letter over Delilah's shoulder. "The 14th is 12 days away," she said. "I know." "Is that enough time to—" "It'll have to be," Delilah said. It was not, in fact, enough time to feel ready. But she had stopped waiting to feel ready a long time ago, somewhere around the 3rd year under Harlan's roof, when she'd learned that readiness was mostly a story people told themselves to avoid doing the next necessary thing. You did the next thing, ready or not. The days between the letter and the 14th had a different texture than the days before. Before, the waiting had been shapeless, a general dread without an address. Now it had a date on it, which was both better and worse. Better because a specific thing could be prepared for. Worse because the mind, given a specific date, will count down to it whether you ask it to or not. Maeve organized her documents for the 4th time. They were already organized, had been organized since the 2nd week at the ranch. But she went through them again anyway, re-examining each page with the meticulous focus of someone who understands that the difference between winning and losing in a courthouse is often one missed detail, one document in the wrong order, one number that doesn't match the one before it. Delilah found her at the desk past midnight one evening, still at it. "You've checked those 3 times today," she said. "I know," Maeve said, without looking up. "Checking them a 4th time won't change what's in them." "I know that too." Maeve set down the page she was holding. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands, a gesture that made her look, briefly, younger than she was. If there's something wrong, if there's something he can use to counter what we've put together, I need to find it before he does." "Farrell's already done this." "Farrell's good. He's not infallible." She picked up the page again. "And this is our lives, Delilah. This isn't a contract dispute. This is the thing that decides whether we're free people or whether we spend the next 5 years looking over our shoulders." Delilah sat down in the chair across the desk. She didn't try to talk Maeve out of the late-night document review because she understood the impulse, the need to do something with the fear, to turn it into work, to make it useful. She'd been doing the same thing in the barn with the horses, spending extra hours she didn't strictly need to spend because the horses were honest and the work with them was real. And when she was working a horse, she wasn't thinking about Harlan or Harwick or what the next 12 days might bring. "He's going to claim the documents are falsified," Delilah said. "I know. What do we have to counter that?" Maeve pulled a separate folder from beneath the main stack. "Garrett's testimony, first of all. He worked the estate and he kept his own records. He told Farrell he started doing it when he got suspicious about where the operating money was going. He's not a lawyer and he's not educated, but he can read a ledger and he kept a journal, and his journal entries corroborate what I documented." She opened the folder and took out a handwritten page. "Second, Farrell found the original land assessments for the Whitaker property, done by a county surveyor 4 years before Papa died. The property was assessed at $8,000. Harlan's papers claimed it was worth less than $900 when he took over the estate. $8,000 to $900. In 4 years, with no significant change to the land or the improvements on it. Maeve set the page down. He'll say the market fell. He'll say conditions changed. But Farrell's also got assessments for 3 comparable properties in the same period, and their values held. She looked at Delilah. It's not just that the numbers are wrong, it's that they're wrong in a direction that exclusively benefits him. Delilah was quiet for a moment.
Maeve, you've built something real here. We've built something, Maeve said with a deflection that was half habit and half genuine, and then she stopped herself. I've built something, she corrected quietly, as if trying out the words to see if they fit. I actually have. Yes, Delilah said. You have.
Maeve looked at the paper spread across the desk, and something shifted in her expression. Not pride exactly, but the careful acknowledgement of competence. The particular look of a person who has been told for years that they are less than they are, and has finally done something that is difficult to argue with. Go to sleep, she said. I'll be done soon. Artsang. Gideon found Delilah in the north pasture 2 mornings before they were due to leave for Harwick. She was not working. She was leaning on the fence, looking out at the horses moving in the early light, doing nothing except being present in the cold morning air, with her coat pulled close and her breath making small clouds that disappeared immediately. He came up beside her and leaned on the fence the same way, and for a while neither of them said anything. You're not sleeping, he said eventually. Neither are you, she said. A beat. No, he agreed. The horses moved in the pasture, unhurried, following the logic of horses, drifting toward the best grass, arranging themselves in the loose social geometry of animals that know each other well. The bay gelding that Delilah had been working for weeks had become, by general consensus, hers. He came to her call and followed her at the fence and stood quietly under her hands in a way he didn't with anyone else. And she watched him now with something close to fondness, which was its own quiet surprise. She hadn't expected to feel fond of anything here. She'd been braced for it all to be temporary. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. When you came to that auction, you didn't know us. You didn't know anything about us except that we were 4 women on a wagon and our uncle was selling our contracts for $20. She paused. Why did you do it? He was quiet for a while, long enough that she wondered if he was going to answer. Then he said, I knew your father. She turned to look at him. Not well, he said. We met twice at the Stockmen's Association meetings in Harwick, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. He was a good man, straightforward, honest about his operation, didn't try to make it sound better than it was. He looked at the horses. After my wife died, I let things go for a while. The ranch, the accounts, the relationships with other operators. I let most of it slide. He paused. I heard your father had died and left daughters, and I heard some things about the brother-in-law that I didn't pay enough attention to at the time because I wasn't paying attention to much at that point. He was quiet again. When I heard about the auction, I was in Red Hollow on supply business. I didn't plan it. I'd let something go that I shouldn't have let go. And here was the same situation presenting itself again. You felt guilty, Delilah said. I felt responsible, he said, which is different. Guilt sits there. Responsibility asks what you're going to do about it. She turned that over. You paid $300 for responsibility, she said, and got considerably more than I paid for, he said, and the way he said it was not what she expected. There was something in it that was warmer than his usual delivery, something that did not quite have the flat quality of a simple statement of fact. It landed differently. She noticed it landing differently and said nothing about it, because she was not, she reminded herself, someone who moved fast toward things she wasn't sure of. What we're going to face in Harwick, she said, returning to the thing that had been sitting on her chest for days. It's not just the legal proceeding. It's being in a room with him again, being in a room where he gets to speak and we have to sit there while he speaks. I know. I'm not sure I can do that calmly. You don't have to be calm, Gideon said. You have to be controlled. Those aren't the same thing. She thought about that. How do you do it? You stood in this yard while he was here and you never raised your voice. You handed him back his writ like it was a grocery list. I was angry, Gideon said. I was very angry, particularly when he reached for Ivy. Something in his jaw tightened briefly and then released. But anger without direction is just noise. I knew what the situation needed. It needed steadiness,
So that's what I gave it. And afterward?
Afterward, I went to the barn and spent 2 hours repairing things that didn't particularly need repairing, he said.
She almost laughed. It surprised her. The almost laugh rose up before she could catch it. That's your version of my extra hours with the horses? Probably, he said, and she could hear something in his voice that was very quietly a smile. They stood at the fence for a while longer, and the morning came up around them, and the horses moved in their unhurried way across the frost-stiff grass, and it was one of those moments that Delilah recognized even as it was happening, the kind you file away not because anything dramatic occurs, but because it is unexpectedly good, and goodness in her experience was a thing worth noting. But they left for Harwick on the 13th. All four sisters, Gideon and Jake, who had been to Harwick before and knew the roads and knew which of the two hotels had bedbugs and which one didn't. Nettie stayed with the ranch, in charge of Percy and Tom, which she accepted with the brisk composure of a woman who had been running things long before she was officially asked to. "Don't do anything permanent," she told Gideon at the door. "I'll try," he said. "I'm talking about the ranch," she said. "You can be as permanent as you like in Harwick." It was the closest Nettie had come to saying anything about the situation between Gideon and Delilah, and she said it with her back already turned, which was how Nettie handled most things she considered settled. The road to Harwick took them through country that was different from the valley around the ranch. Steeper, more closed in, the mountains pressing closer on both sides before the land opened again into the broader terrain of the county seat. They rode mostly in silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that exists between people who have run out of things to say because they've already said most of them, and the rest will have to wait. Ivy painted from the wagon seat. She had taken to keeping a small sketchbook with her, and her hand moved across it while the landscape passed, catching impressions. The angle of a ridge, a stand of aspen, the way the road curved ahead of them through the shadow of the trees. It was how she managed being afraid. Clara sat beside her and watched the road, and Maeve had her documents in a leather satchel on her lap that she had not let out of her hand since they left. Delilah rode. She rode because sitting in a wagon made her feel passive, and being passive, today of all days, was not something she could afford to feel. She rode alongside the wagon on the bay gelding, who moved well on roads and had the calm, attentive temperament of a horse that had been treated right and knew it. Farrell met them at the hotel. He looked the same as the last time, small, precise, the suit that had been good once. He had a younger man with him, an assistant named Cray, who moved through doorways like someone who was perpetually slightly afraid of something but had learned to function despite it, and who turned out to be extraordinarily competent when he sat down at a table with paperwork. Whitaker arrived this morning, Farrell said, once they were settled in the hotel's private sitting room, which Gideon had hired for the evening. He brought two men I don't recognize, not lawyers, but well-dressed, money. He's trying to make it look like a legitimate proceeding on his side, Maeve said. Yes. He's also filed a counter-petition this afternoon claiming that the documents you've provided are fabricated and that the assessment differential can be explained by improvements he personally made to the property after taking over the estate. Maeve's eyes went sharp. What improvements? He's claiming he rebuilt the north barn and extended the eastern fencing. Well, he didn't, she said flatly. The north barn was there when Papa bought the property 30 years ago. The eastern fence was put in by Papa in the spring before he died. I remember it because I helped carry posts. She looked at Farrell. Do you need me to put that in writing? I need you to say it under oath tomorrow, Farrell said, with the small, restrained precision of a man who has just been handed exactly what he needed. Can you do that? Yes, Maeve said. Easily. And the fence, Delilah said. Do you remember anything specific about it? Something verifiable? Maeve thought for a moment. Papa had the county land surveyor out that spring to remark the eastern boundary. There would be a survey record with the county office. The fence was built after the survey, which would be in Papa's own receipts. He kept every receipt, always. It was a habit. She paused. If those receipts are still in the estate materials— They are, Farrell said. Garrett kept a copy of everything he thought might be relevant. He had the receipt for the fence materials, which is itemized and dated. He looked at Maeve for a moment. Mr. Whitaker's counter-petition is going to have a difficult morning. Maeve sat back in her chair. She did not say anything, but the expression on her face was one Delilah had not seen in years. The particular quiet relief of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing and just felt another pair of hands take some of the weight. The hearing was in this county courthouse, a solid stone building on the main street of Harwick that smelled of old paper and floor polish, and the particular institutional permanence of places where official things happen. They arrived early, because Farrell was a man who arrived early, and they sat on one side of the large paneled room with Farrell and Cray and their organized stack of documents, and across the room Harlan Whitaker sat with his two well-dressed men and a lawyer Delilah didn't know. She saw Harlan before he saw her. He was talking to his lawyer, bent slightly toward him, his good coat on again, his face set in the arrangement it took when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. She had seen that performance her entire life, and she could read it accurately. The slight tightness around the eyes, the way his hands were folded on the table a little too carefully. He was afraid. She had never seen him afraid before. She had seen him angry, dismissive, coldly certain of his own authority, but not afraid. It looked strange on him, like a coat that didn't fit. When he finally looked across the room and saw her, she held his gaze. She did not look away first. Not this time. The judge was a spare, white-haired man named Abernathy, who had the economical manner of someone who had been listening to people try to deceive him for decades and had run out of patience for anything that wasted his time. He read through the filed documents with his glasses on the end of his nose and his expression unreadable. And then he set them down and looked at both sides of the room. "We're here on a matter of estate administration and financial misconduct," he said. "I've read the filings. I want testimony, not argument. Mr. Farrell, you may proceed." Farrell called Maeve first. She walked to the witness stand with her documents and her straight back and her careful eyes, and she explained what she had found and how she had found it and what it meant, and she did it the way she had done it at the kitchen table in Farrell's first meeting with them, with precision, with detail, without decoration. When Harlan's lawyer rose to question her about the counterclaim of improvements, she answered him with the survey date and the receipt for fence materials, which she produced from the satchel that had not left her hand since they left the ranch. And the lawyer sat down without completing his follow-up question. Garrett was next. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s who still had the weathered look of someone who had spent his adult life working outdoors, and he sat in the witness chair with the careful dignity of a man who understood that the thing he was about to say mattered, and he said it clearly. And he did not look at Harlan while he said it except once, near the end, when he said, "I kept records because I could see what was happening, and I thought someday someone might need to know." And he looked at Harlan for just a moment then, directly and without malice, which was somehow worse than anger. Clara testified about conditions. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything medical, methodically, removing sentiment from the structure of it and presenting facts, dates, specifics. The winter of the chairs, the shoes. The year Ivy had gotten sick and there had been no money for the doctor, and Clara had treated her herself with what she could find and a great deal of fear. She said it all, without her voice breaking, and the room was very quiet. Harlan's lawyer tried to suggest that these were exaggerations, the complaints of young women who had been ungrateful for the provision made for them. "I'm not claiming exaggeration," Clara said, looking at him with a flatness that Delilah recognized as the face Clara wore when she was done being patient. "I'm telling you what happened. You can call it what you like." Harlan was called to testify. He was good. Delilah gave him that. He was practiced and he was plausible, and he had clearly rehearsed, and his lawyer led him through a version of events that had its own internal consistency if you didn't look too closely at the parts where the numbers should have added up and didn't. He spoke about the burdens of guardianship, the difficulty of managing an estate in a poor market, his genuine concern for his niece's welfare. He said he had been shocked by what Gideon Cross had done at that auction, shocked and frightened for his family, and he had sought legal remedy as any responsible man would. He was good at it. His voice carried concern. His face carried concern. And across the room, Delilah watched the judge. Not Harlan, because the judge was what mattered. Abernathy watched Harlan the way a man watches something he is trying to classify. Farrell rose for his cross-examination. He was unhurried. He had a particular question about the property assessment, the 8,000 to 900 differential, and he asked about it in the precise, quiet way of a man who already knows the answer and is waiting to see which explanation will be offered. Harlan offered 3 different explanations in succession,
each one slightly inconsistent with the last, and Farrell simply noted each one and moved to the next question, letting the contradictions accumulate without pointing at them directly. Because pointing at them directly was not necessary when you could simply line them up and let them stand. When Harlan's voice started to take on the particular edge of a man who is running out of ground, Farrell asked one final question. Mr. Whitaker, the auction in Red Hollow. You accepted $300 for the labor contracts of your 4 nieces signed and witnessed. Is that correct? The circumstances were yes or no, please. A pause. Yes. Thank you, Farrell said and sat down. Abernathy recessed for 2 hours. They waited in the hotel's sitting room. Nobody wanted to eat. Nettie had packed food for the road, and Ivy ate some of it because she needed something to do with her hands, and Gideon stood by the window and looked at the street, and Delilah sat at the table and did not pretend to do anything except wait. What do you think? Claire asked Farrell when the silence became too much. I think the judge is writing something right now, Farrell said, with the careful neutrality of a man who will not promise what he cannot guarantee. But he asked Harlan to stay available. He paused, and something in his expression allowed itself to shift, just slightly. Judges who are going to rule for the respondent do not typically ask the claimant to stay available. The 2 hours went the way 2 hours go when you are waiting for something that will change your life. Too slowly, and then all at once. They were back in the courtroom. Abernathy settled his papers and looked at both sides of the room. The financial records presented by the respondent's counsel are consistent, detailed, and corroborated by independent testimony, he said in his spare, economical voice. The counterclaims presented by the claimant are inconsistent with physical evidence and with the claimant's own testimony under cross-examination. He removed his glasses. The original estate has been misadministered in a manner that constitutes deliberate financial misconduct. The claimant's counterpetition is dismissed. The writ obtained from the Caldwell courthouse is nullified, as it was obtained on the basis of materially false representations. He looked at Harlan's table. The matter will be referred to the county prosecutor for formal indictment proceedings. Mr. Whitaker, you are released on your own recognizance pending those proceedings. You are advised not to leave the county and not to approach the respondents or their place of residence. The well-dressed men at Harlan's table were leaning toward each other, murmuring. Harlan himself sat very still. His face had gone through several colors in the space of 30 seconds and had settled on something Delilah had never seen on him before. The flat, stripped expression of a man who has been publicly and completely found out. Not just losing, being seen. She looked at him for a moment. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the vindication she had spent years imagining when she'd allowed herself to imagine it. She felt mostly tired. The specific exhaustion of a long thing finally ending. And underneath the exhaustion, quiet and stubborn, the first small roots of something that was not yet peace but was growing toward it. Miss Whitaker. She looked up. Abernathy was looking at her. The court recognizes the 4 Whitaker sisters as free persons of legal majority with full right to determine their own residence, employment, and affairs. That recognition is now part of the court record. He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she had the sense that he was not entirely unaware of what it meant to say that particular thing in a courtroom to 4 women who had been auctioned in a public square 6 months ago. Good luck to you. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. Her voice came out steady. She had not been entirely sure that it would. Outside the courthouse, on the stone steps with the afternoon light coming flat and cold off the mountains, Clara sat down and put her face in her hands and cried. Not the desperate crying of fear, but the released kind, the kind that comes when a door finally opens. Percy would have been there if he hadn't been back at the ranch, and Clara would probably have been embarrassed by that later, and right now didn't care. Ivy stood beside her and rubbed her back and stared at the mountains with her eyes bright and her mouth pressed closed around everything she was feeling. Maeve stood very still on the top step, holding her satchel against her chest, and when Delilah came to stand beside her, she said, I want to write it down, which was such a completely Maeve response to the moment that Delilah almost laughed again, and this time the almost laugh made it all the way out. Write it down later, she said. Be here for now.
Maeve stood there for a moment being there. Then she said very quietly, "We did it. You did most of it." "No," Maeve said. "All four of us. Every single piece of it." She looked at Delilah. "Don't take less than your share, not anymore. We're past that." Delilah felt that settle somewhere important. Gideon came out of the courthouse behind them. He stopped beside Delilah and looked out at the street. And she didn't look at him, but she was aware of him the way she had become aware of him over the past months. A steady, particular awareness. The kind that doesn't announce itself but is always there. The way you're aware of a source of warmth in a cold room. "Farrell says the indictment proceedings will take a few months," he said. "I know. In the meantime," he paused. "In the meantime, you're free. Legally, on paper, in the court record. Whatever comes next is entirely your choice." She looked at him then. His face had its usual quality of being difficult to read from the outside, but she was not outside it anymore, hadn't been for some time, and she could see what was in it, the question he was asking, the careful way he was asking it, the fact that he was asking it at all, when a different man might have assumed. "I know what I want to do next," she said. He waited. "I want to go home," she said. "I want to go back to the ranch, and I want to see what we can build now that we're not spending half our energy looking over our shoulders." She paused. "If that's still—" "It's still," he said, before she finished. And the way he said it was quiet and certain. The way he was quiet and certain about most things. The way she had learned to read as the truest form of what he meant. Behind them, Claire had stopped crying. Ivy was saying something that made her laugh, and Maeve was sitting on the step beside her with the satchel finally set down, her hands free, looking out at the town with an expression that was not quite peace and not quite joy, but was somewhere between them, growing toward both. The afternoon light lay across the street of Harwick, and the mountains were visible at the far end of it, and the road home was 40 miles of good country. Delilah turned her face toward it. The road home was 40 miles, and they took it slowly, because there was, for the first time in longer than any of them could clearly remember, no particular reason to rush. That was the strange thing about the ride back. Not the relief, which Delilah had expected. Not the exhaustion, which she had also expected. The strange thing was the absence of urgency. The way the hours on that road had a different quality than every hour of the past several months, because for those hours nothing was coming at them, and nothing needed to be outrun. The mountains sat where they had always sat. The road unrolled the same way it always had. But the four of them moved through it differently, the way you move through familiar country after a long illness. Noticing things you'd stopped noticing, finding the ordinary newly interesting because you weren't too frightened to look at it. Ivy drew the whole way. Her sketchbook was half filled by the time they reached the valley. Clara fell asleep against the wagon's side rail somewhere after the second hour and woke up when the wheel hit a rock, startled and embarrassed. And Percy, who was not there but who Clara had apparently been half dreaming about, because she said his name before she was fully awake, would never know about it, which was probably for the best. Maeve did not sleep and did not draw. She sat with her empty hands in her lap, the satchel finally stowed properly in the wagon bed, and she looked at the country passing, and she did something Delilah had not seen her do in a very long time. Nothing. Just sat. Just looked. There was a line between her brows that had been there so long Delilah sometimes forgot it was tension rather than just Maeve's face, and on that ride home, somewhere between the third and fourth hour, it eased. Not gone. Not fully. Some things take more than an afternoon to release. But eased, and the difference was visible, and Delilah noted it the way she noted all the things she was afraid to trust too much. She rode alongside the wagon and said nothing to anyone, and that was all right. Nettie was at the door when they came through the gate. She looked at their faces the way she looked at everything, practically, reading what was there without sentiment. And then she stood back from the door and said, "Supper's ready. Wash up." Percy was in the barn but came out when he heard the wagon, and when Clara climbed down he was suddenly busy with the harness in a way that was transparently an excuse to be in the immediate vicinity. And Clara, who was not unaware of this, found something that needed checking on the wagon's far side, which put them approximately 4 feet apart for a good 3 minutes, while both of them pretended to be engaged in unrelated tasks. Tom watched this from the barn door with the expression of a man who has observed a slow-moving situation for months, and has given up expecting a resolution.
Delilah took the bay gelding to the corral and unsaddled him herself. She worked slowly, not from tiredness, but from the particular pleasure of a task that required only her hands and her attention, the familiar smell of horse and leather and cool evening air, the sounds of the ranch settling into its end-of-day rhythms around her. She brushed him down, and he stood for it with the patience of an animal that has learned to trust the person holding the brush. And when she was done, she stayed in the corral a little longer than necessary, leaning on the fence in the gathering dark.
"Good day?" Gideon's voice came from behind her. "Good day," she said.
He came to stand beside her at the fence, and she was aware, as she had been for weeks, of the careful way he occupied space near her, present and close without pressing, the way he was about most things. She had spent a considerable amount of time recently trying to understand what she felt about that, turning it over in the way you turn over a stone to see what's beneath it, half expecting something that would make her step back. But what she found, each time she looked, was the same thing, a steadiness she hadn't asked for and didn't resent. It had arrived the same way everything at this ranch had arrived, without announcement, through accumulated evidence rather than a single dramatic moment. She was not a woman who trusted dramatic moments. She had seen too many of them turn into something worse than what came before. What she trusted was the pattern of small things, and the pattern here was good. Farrell says the indictment timeline is 3 months, maybe 4, Gideon said. I know. She paused. I'm not thinking about that tonight. He was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking about? She considered. The spring contracts, she said. Jake was telling me there's a new cavalry post opening up near Henderson Creek. They'll need horses. If we get the breeding program going this winter, we could have 8 to 10 animals ready by June. She glanced at him. Maeve ran the numbers last week. The margin is better than the cattle, if we do it right. We? He said. She heard it. The word had come out before she'd made the conscious decision to use it, and she heard it land, and she did not take it back. We, she said. He looked at her. The last of the light was going off the mountains, the sky above them that deep blue that comes just before dark, and his face in it was the face she had come to know well. Not easy, not simple, marked by years she only partly understood. And looking at it, she felt the same thing she always felt when she let herself look at him without managing it, that this was a person she did not regret being near. That works for me, he said. Simple. No embellishment, just the truth of it stated plainly, which was how he said every true thing. Good, she said, and turned back to the horses. So, winter came to the valley in early November, which was not early by mountain standards, but was early enough to feel like a statement. It came the way all real weather comes, gradually, then decisively. The first snow was light, a dusting that sat on the fence rails and the barn roof and had melted by noon. The second came a week later and stayed. By the end of November, the mountains above the valley were white down to their lower shoulders, and the creek ran slower, and the mornings required an extra layer and an extra few minutes to get the stoves going before anything else was possible. The ranch did not slow down. Ranches in winter don't slow down so much as they change their character. The work moves inside or becomes about preparation rather than production, and the days are shorter but no less full. There were animals to care for and equipment to maintain and accounts to manage and a breeding program to design. And there was always, in a working household, the steady background labor of keeping everyone warm and fed and in good enough repair to do it all again the next day. Maeve's accounts had, by November, transformed the financial picture of the Cross Ranch in ways that Gideon occasionally looked at with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to be impressed or embarrassed about the years before. Don't be embarrassed, Maeve told him when she caught that expression. You were running it the way someone runs something alone. You had no one to see the parts you couldn't see. And now you have someone who does nothing but see those parts, she said, with the small, dry satisfaction of a person who has found their correct use. The Henderson Creek contracts, the timber operation next spring, the revised supplier agreements. If it all goes as projected, you're looking at a 40% improvement in operating margin by autumn. 40%, he said. Minimum, she said. I've been conservative. He looked at the numbers she'd laid out. You should have your name on these accounts, he said. Not just as a worker, as a partner. You've built half of this. Maeve looked at him for a moment. It was the kind of offer that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Not because it was beyond imagining, but because imagining it would have required a foundation of evidence she hadn't had yet. Now she had the evidence. She looked at the numbers that her own intelligence had produced and she said, "Yes, I'd like that." It was not a grand moment. There was no ceremony to it. Two people at a desk agreeing to a thing that was fair, and the fairness of it being unremarkable. That was, Delilah thought later when Maeve told her about it, exactly the kind of moment that matters. Not the kind that makes a good story, the kind that makes a good life. Checked. Harlan's indictment came through in February. Farrell wrote to tell them, and Maeve read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, and the room received it the way you receive news you have been expecting. Not with the sharp shock of a surprise, but with the release of a tension you'd been holding without fully registering the effort it required. "What happens now?" Ivy asked. "He'll be tried," Maeve said. "Farrell says the evidence is strong. The prosecutor is confident. And if he's convicted? Fines, at minimum, possibly custody, depending on the judge." Maeve set the letter down. "Either way, the estate proceedings are separate. Farrell's filed for a civil recovery. The amount won't be everything we lost. You can't get back years, but it will be something, and it will be on record." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "I don't want money," she said. "I mean, I'm glad about the legal part. I understand why it matters. But that's not what I—" She stopped, started again. "What I wanted was for it to not be possible anymore, for him to not be able to do it again. To us or to anyone else." "That's what this does," Clara said. "That's exactly what this does." Ivy nodded. She was looking at her hands, and then she looked up at the window, where the February light came in at a low angle across the table, and she said, "I finished the big painting." Everyone looked at her. "The one I've been working on since October," she said. "The valley, with the ranch in the middle distance, and the mountains behind. It's the biggest thing I've done." She paused. "I want to show it tonight." She showed it after supper when everyone was in the main room. All four sisters, Gideon, Nettie, Jake, Tom, and Percy, which was all the people who made up the daily fabric of the ranch, gathered without particular formality around the fire. Ivy had done the painting on a large canvas that she'd built herself, stretching and priming it over the course of 2 weeks with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about. It showed the valley from the high eastern ridge, the same view she'd sketched that first autumn, but larger and deeper now, richer with the specific knowledge of months spent in the place. The exact blue of the mountains in winter light, the way the ranch buildings sat in the valley floor like something that had grown there rather than been built. The creek line visible at the lower edge, the sky above enormous and real. It was simply a very good painting. Not just good for someone self-taught, not just good for a 16-year-old who'd been told for years she had no talent. Just good. The way things are good when the person who made them understood what they were doing and cared about doing it right. The room was quiet when she brought it out. Gideon looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "That's our home." "Yes," Ivy said. "Where are you going to put it?" She looked at him, then at the wall above the fireplace, which had nothing on it, had never had anything on it, in all the months they'd been here, just the blank planed wood of the wall with the firelight moving across it. "There," she said. "If that's all right." "It's more than all right," Gideon said. Percy hung it that evening, with more care than was strictly required and more instruction from Ivy than he was strictly comfortable with. And when it was done and they all stood back to look at it, Nettie said, finally, in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for a room to be finished for a long time. Spring came late that year, but it came. The horses were ready before the Henderson Creek contracts were finalized, which meant 3 weeks of waiting that Delilah handled by working the animals harder, which was good for them and probably good for her. When the contracts came through, 8 horses at a price. Maeve had negotiated from the original offer by citing comparable sales records from 3 other territories. She stood in the north pasture on the morning the cavalry buyers came and watched them load the animals she had trained from young, half-broke ranch stock into horses that a man could trust in difficult country, and felt something she took a moment to name: pride. Uncomplicated, earned pride, with nothing underneath it except the work it had come from. One of the buyers, an older man who had purchased horses for the cavalry for 20 years, and had the look of someone who was not easily impressed, stopped beside her while the others loaded. "These are good animals," he said. "They are," she said. "You train them yourself?" "With Jake's help, he knows the bloodlines better than I do." The man looked at the horses, then at her. "Where'd you learn?" "My father," she said. "Good teacher." "The best," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't let herself mean it for years, because grief has a way of making you avoid the things you loved about someone in order to avoid the grief. And she had been doing that without fully knowing it, and standing in that pasture on that morning, she let herself stop. Her father had been a good man and a good teacher, and he had loved her and her sisters with a simple, undramatic love that had not required anything from them except that they be themselves. And it was not his fault that he had died and left them to Harlan, and it was not their fault either. And the life they were building now was not a replacement for what they'd had, or a compensation for what they'd lost. It was its own thing. It was what came next. She stood in the pasture until the buyers had loaded and gone, and then she walked back toward the barn, and the morning was ordinary and bright, and hers. The letter from Farrell in May was the last official one. Harlan Whitaker had been convicted on 2 counts of financial fraud. He had been fined substantially and sentenced to 18 months in the county workhouse. The civil recovery for the Whitaker estate had resulted in a judgment of $4,200, which Farrell had arranged to be paid in installments through the court rather than left to Harlan's discretion. The sisters would receive their share quarterly, the first payment already held in the Harwick court account. Maeve read the letter at the desk in the office. Her office now, functionally, the room that had been reorganized around her presence so thoroughly that it was hard to remember it had ever belonged to anyone else. And she sat with it for a long time before she went to find Delilah. Delilah was in the corral. She was always in the corral. Maeve stood at the fence and held out the letter. Delilah read it. She read it through twice, the way she always read things that mattered, and then she folded it and handed it back. "It's over," Maeve said. "Yes," Delilah said. "How do you feel?" Delilah thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Tired," she said. "Relieved. A little strange." "Strange how?" "We spent so long with it hanging over us that I'm not sure what it feels like to not have it hanging over us." She paused. "I keep expecting the next problem, waiting for the next rider coming down the track." Maeve leaned on the fence beside her. "Maybe that doesn't go away right away," she said. "Maybe you're allowed to keep watching for a while and eventually realize nothing's coming." "Maybe," Delilah said. She looked at the horses. "Or maybe we just get better things to watch for." Midsummer brought changes that nobody had planned but that felt, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Clara and Percy had, over the course of a winter and a spring, conducted the world's most gradually acknowledged courtship, progressing from proximity to conversation to the kind of easy, habitual company that the people around them had accepted as a permanent feature of the ranch, long before the 2 people involved had officially said anything about it. When Percy finally said something, to Clara and then to Delilah, because he was a young man with enough sense to understand the importance of that conversation, Clara's response was characteristically direct. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for you to get there." Percy went red to his ears. "How long have you known?" "Since February," she said. "Maybe January." "Why didn't you "Because it was yours to say," she told him, "not mine." That was Clara entirely. She understood bodies and what they needed, and she had the patience of someone who had learned to wait out pain without panicking, and she applied the same quality to everything else. She would not rush a thing that needed its own time. But once the time had come, she moved without hesitation. Delilah was not surprised. She was glad. In the uncomplicated way she was glad when something good happened to someone who had not had enough good things, glad and also quietly grateful for what it meant, which was that Clara was building a future in this place, was putting down the kind of root that doesn't easily come back up. Ivy turned 17 in August. Nettie made a cake that was imperfect in the way Nettie's cakes always were. A little lopsided, with the frosting applied by someone whose standards were culinary rather than aesthetic. And Tom made a joke about it that Nettie pretended not to find funny and clearly did. Ivy blew out the candles and said she wanted nothing except to keep painting, which everyone took as a complete and sufficient answer. A man from the city had written to inquire about the painting Ivy had done for the Stockmen's Association quarterly report, Maeve's idea, who had suggested submitting it when the association solicited illustrations and had not told Ivy until after it was accepted, which had produced a response from Ivy that lasted approximately 4 minutes and was mostly speechless. The man wanted to know if the artist was available for commercial work. "What do you want to do?" Gideon asked her. Ivy sat with the letter for a long time. She was 17 and had spent most of her remembered life being told that what she made had no value. And here was evidence to the contrary in writing from a city 200 miles away, and she was trying to work out how to hold that without either dismissing it or letting it make her into someone she didn't want to be. "I want to paint what I want to paint," she said finally, "not what someone tells me to." "Then tell him that," Gideon said. "Tell him you'll accept commissions that are compatible with your own work and decline the ones that aren't. That's how it should work." "Will that scare him off?" "If it does, he wasn't the right buyer," Gideon said simply. Ivy wrote back. The man accepted her terms without negotiation, which turned out to be the beginning of something that nobody could have fully predicted from where they stood that August afternoon. But that was how most important things began. Not with certainty, just with one honest step in a chosen direction. It was Gideon who chose an evening in October. The first anniversary of their arrival at the ranch was a few weeks away, and the mountains had gone to their autumn colors, the aspen burning gold against the dark of the pine, the high ridges already white, the light in the late afternoons going that particular quality of October light that is beautiful specifically because it knows it won't last. They had been sitting on the porch after supper in the way they sometimes did on evenings that were cold enough to need a coat but clear enough to make the cold worthwhile. Delilah with a mug of coffee and Gideon without anything, both of them looking at the sky, doing what it did at that hour. He said, "I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him. In a year of learning to read his face, she had never seen it quite like this. The usual steadiness was there, but underneath it something that was, she realized with a start, nerves. Actual nerves. The things she would have said 6 months ago he probably didn't experience. "Go ahead," she said. "I don't know how to do this the right way," he said, which was the most unexpected thing he had ever said to her, because he was a man who generally knew how to do things and was uncomfortable when he didn't. "I've been thinking about it for a while, and I haven't been able to find a way that doesn't sound like I'm either asking too much or not asking enough." Delilah set down her coffee. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a worker, not as whatever the last year has been, which has been good, which has been better than I knew how to expect. I want to ask you to stay as—" He stopped, started again. "I want to marry you, if you want that. I'm not assuming you want that." The mountains were going dark at the edges, and the sky above them was the color of something between blue and black, and the firelight came through the window behind them and lay across the porch boards, and Delilah sat with what he'd said and gave it the consideration it deserved. She thought about the woman who had stood on that auction wagon 8 months ago, looking at the horizon and deciding she would not give the crowd the satisfaction of her eyes. She thought about the girl before that, the one who had learned to hold herself against the slow erosion of years, with a man who believed that people were resources to be used and discarded. She thought about what she had believed for a long time about herself and about what she could expect from the world. She thought about a man who had stood at a fence in the rain to watch her work because he thought it was worth watching. Who had asked for Ivy's painting because he understood it wasn't his to take. Who had stood between a child and a reaching hand and said one word, without raising his voice, and meant it completely. Who had said, "I'm sorry," without condition or defense, and then kept his word. She was not a person who confused comfort with complacency. She was not a person who would agree to anything simply because it was offered or because the alternative was harder. She had earned, through considerable difficulty, the right to choose carefully and to mean what she chose. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes?" "I'm not someone who says things she doesn't mean," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. And then, in the way he had of occasionally saying something that landed differently than expected. "I've known that since the auction, when you asked me why I wasn't going to separate you, and you held my answer up to the light before you decided whether you believed it." She looked at him for a moment. "You noticed that." "I notice most things," he said. "I just don't always say them." She
She would work on that, she thought, the not always saying them. Not because she needed him to be a different person, but because some things were worth the effort of being said, and she had learned enough in the past year to know that the people who would actually do the work of saying them were rarer than you wanted them to be, and worth more than you usually admitted. "I'll tell my sisters in the morning," she said. "They already know," he said. She looked at him. "Maeve figured it out in January," he said. "Clara told me she'd been expecting it since the trial. Ivy asked me in April what my intentions were." A pause. "She was 16 at the time. I found it fairly alarming." Delilah thought about Ivy, her youngest sister, 17 years old, and still sometimes shaking when she was frightened but never backing down, painting the world the way she actually saw it rather than the way she'd been told to see it. Asking a grown man what his intentions were because she was not going to let someone she loved be treated carelessly ever again. "That's my sister," she said. "Yes," he said, and said it with warmth, the kind that had built up over months, quiet and unannounced and permanent. The winter that year was long, as mountain winters are, but the house was warm in the way that houses are warm when they are full. Not just the physical warmth of good fires and solid walls, but the other kind. The kind that comes from people who have been through difficult things together and chosen to stay. Suppers that went long because nobody was in a hurry to leave the table. Evenings with the fire going and Ivy painting in the corner and Maeve at her accounts and Clara reading aloud to Percy, who had never been much of a reader himself but liked the sound of her voice and had eventually stopped pretending otherwise. Gideon sitting across from Delilah after the others had gone to bed, talking about the spring contracts or the breeding program, or sometimes about nothing in particular. The way you talk to someone when conversation itself is the point, and not just the vehicle for information. There were hard days. The winter brought illness to the ranch, nothing life-threatening, but enough to close down normal operations for 2 weeks and test everyone's patience, including Nettie's, which was the most robust patience any of them had encountered. Tom injured his hand and Clara fixed it, better than he'd had it fixed before. The creek flooded in January in a way that damaged the south fence, and rebuilding it in February cold was nobody's idea of a good time. There were disagreements. Delilah and Gideon had 2 serious arguments that winter, both about decisions that had been made without full consultation, both resolved the same way, with directness and without lasting damage, because both of them were too familiar with the cost of unresolved things to let them calcify. It was not always easy. It was honest, which is its own kind of hard work, and they were both, it turned out, willing to do that work. Harlan's payments arrived quarterly, processed through the Harwick court as ordered. They were not large enough to represent justice, because money rarely does represent justice in any complete sense. But they were real, and they were consistent, and they went into an account in all 4 sisters' names that Maeve managed with the focused attention she brought to everything financial. She had plans for it, modest plans, careful ones, the kind of plans that build slowly and last. The following spring, a family from the eastern settlements came through looking for land, and Gideon sold them the parcel at the valley's south edge that he'd been holding unused for years. The family built a house. 6 months later, another family came, and then 2 more. And by the following autumn, there were enough people in the surrounding land that someone put up a small trading post at the crossroads 3 miles down. And a school teacher arrived from the territory capital looking for a position and found there were now enough children to justify one. It had not been planned. It was simply what happened when you built something well in an empty place. Other people noticed and wanted to be near it. Jake said one evening that the valley was starting to look like a real community. "It's not starting to," Nettie corrected him. "It already is one. You're just noticing." She was right, which was true of most of the things Nettie said. There is a particular thing that happens to people who have been made to feel like burdens. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic reversal, but slowly, through accumulated evidence and earned trust, and the daily practice of being treated as if they matter. They begin to believe it, not because someone told them to, because the evidence becomes undeniable. Delilah had not set out to believe in anything when she stepped off that auction wagon. She had set out to survive, which is a different project. Survival is about minimizing damage. What she had found in this ranch in this valley was something that asked more of her than survival, that asked her to build rather than just endure, to invest rather than just protect. to trust rather than just assess.
She was not, even now, a woman who trusted easily. She suspected she never would be. The years with Harlan had written something into her that she had accepted as a permanent feature of herself. A watchfulness, a tendency to check exits, a slight delay between being offered something good and allowing herself to accept it. She had learned to work around that in herself, to recognize the delay for what it was rather than wisdom, and to choose forward anyway. What she had not expected was that the people she'd found here would be patient with the watchfulness. That Gideon would offer things and then simply wait, without pressure, without hurt, for the evidence to accumulate. That Nettie would understand without being told. That the ranch hands would stop finding the sisters new and start finding them simply present, which was the deepest acceptance. Not being tolerated, not being remarked upon, just being part of the working world of the place. On a morning in late March, with the snow still on the high ridges, but the valley beginning to show its first green, Delilah stood in the north pasture and watched the horses. Maeve came and leaned on the fence beside her, the way she had 100 times. They stood in the familiar silence that didn't require filling. "Do you remember the mountains from the wagon?" Maeve asked. "The ones I was looking at during the auction." "You were looking at them when I found you that day," Maeve said, "when we were still deciding whether to follow Nettie inside. You were looking at the mountains." "I was trying to find something to look at that wasn't the crowd," Delilah said. "I know." Maeve paused. "I used to wonder what you saw in them. I couldn't see what you were looking at." Delilah looked at the mountains now, the familiar mountains of this valley, their shapes known to her in all their weathers, in the way you know the shapes of things you have come to love. "I wasn't seeing anything specific," she said. "I was just looking for something that wasn't going anywhere, something that would still be there no matter what happened next." Maeve stood with that for a moment. The morning was quiet around them, the horses moving in the slow mathematics of their grazing, the smoke from the house rising straight up in the still air. "They're still there," Maeve said. "Yes," Delilah said. This is what she knew, standing in that pasture on that ordinary morning with her sister at her shoulder and the mountains in front of her and the sounds of the working ranch behind her, that the hardest thing is not surviving what wants to break you. Plenty of people survive things. The hardest thing is deciding, after surviving, to build. To take the particular courage that got you through the bad years and point it in a different direction. Not at a threat, but towards something. To stop organizing your life around what might be taken from you and start organizing it around what you are choosing to make. That is a different kind of bravery, quieter and less obvious, and in her experience more sustained. She had not done it alone. She wanted to be honest about that, because she had spent years being too proud to acknowledge what she needed and where it had come from. And she was trying to be done with that. She had done it with 3 sisters who were imperfect and complicated and completely irreplaceable. She had done it with a man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is room. Room to be afraid and still choose, room to be cautious and still move forward, room to say not yet and have that respected, and then room to say yes and have that mean something. The horses grazed. The mountain stood. The valley was full of living. Delilah Whitaker leaned on the fence beside her sister in the cold March morning and thought about nothing and everything at once, the way you do when you've finally arrived somewhere worth arriving at, and the arriving itself is enough.